Hey, welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. I'm Adam Huss. Thanks so much for listening. To be able to listen to the full audio of this podcast and to access all content at Beyond Organic Wine, please consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Beyond Organic Wine Substack. And if you already subscribe, thank you. You make this possible. This episode features Will Bucklin of Bucklin Old Hill Ranch. Will is the caretaker of one of California's oldest vineyards, and he discusses some of the many things we can learn from a vineyard that is over 150 years old. One of the remarkable things about a vineyard that old is that it predates the Green Revolution and the industrialization of modern viticulture. So it reflects a form of wine growing that took its cues from ecology and the limits of the local ecosystems, rather than beliefs in the supremacy of the human capacity to dominate and control nature, and the values of mechanization and mass production. The ancient block is a field blend of over 30 varieties, including some varieties that may only exist in one or two other places on Earth besides this vineyard. The field blend also includes some hybrid grapes, including Catawba and Lenoir, also known as Jaquez or Black Spanish. Will discusses his techniques for dry farming, cover cropping, and his balanced and considered approach to tillage and weed whacking appropriate to his climate and soil, and many other insights of a bespoke form of viticulture that reflects years of observation and respect for the nuanced needs of his land. And he talks about how doing nothing may be the pinnacle of farming. After this conversation, I got to visit Will at the vineyard at the end of January with a group of folks who had attended the Embracing Hybrid Grapes conference 2 days earlier. It was a cool morning with warm California sun. Hawks soared over the ancient vines, and my shoes soaked up the dew from the lush winter growth of plants around the gnarled vines. Vines that had an average age of at least a generation older than the oldest of us humans who came to learn from them, to see them, to be reminded that we were part of something bigger than ourselves. I have a lot of respect and appreciation for Will for letting this vineyard shape his values rather than the other way around. When we tasted the wines from the vineyard, I didn't know what to say other than, wow. What do you say when you get to be part of a story that's as old as the idea of California? We get to hear some of this story from Will, of the original people who tended the stories of this land, then the European settlers who brought vine cuttings in their shoes, and the hundreds of Chinese workers who cared for the vines, and now the many Mexican workers who carry on this timeless work. After we tasted the wines, Will invited us inside the watchtower that overlooks the vineyard. Once we had assembled inside, he pressed enter on his computer and a video began to play that can't be seen anywhere but at the vineyard, because it's too special, maybe too sacred, to be put online. The Super 8 footage takes you back to a harvest from the early 1970s, starting with the gathering of the grapes under the hot California sun of autumn, and carries you in with the bins full of grapes from the ancient vines to the crushing and pressing, and then ends with dinner in the evening and celebration with food and wine and all the faces and hands who helped make it possible. At each step, you see a community working together. No words accompany the sepia-toned images, just a soundtrack that features Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Beethoven, and others. The video was made around the year I was born, but the story it tells is much older. Some of the people in the video are gone now, their stories dissolved into the flow of time to become part of the vines and the soil and the wines that we can drink now and transform into our own lives and stories. The roots of these old vines go down as deep as 40 feet. Some say deeper. We don't really know. They might grow down to the foundations of the earth. Enjoy. Will, welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. Thanks so much for coming on and doing this.
Thank you, Adam, for having me.
Yeah, good morning. This is a nice early time. I like this. The coffee is just kicking in. I'm starting to feel it course through my veins, so hopefully I won't stumble over my words too much. There, because where you farm for Californians is pretty well. I don't know. I would say it's pretty well known. But maybe that's just me. Maybe that's because I'm fascinated in what you do and the way you've done it and that space where you are working. But I was going to say, if you could please just give us an introduction to where you farm and some of the special things about your vineyards.
Sure. We are in the town of Glen Ellen, which is in Sonoma Valley. I would characterize it as the center of the valley. The valley runs really from San Pablo Bay, which is part of the San Francisco Bay, due north up to the town of Kenwood, and we're in the middle of that. So we get a lot of coastal influence.
Mhm.
Um, and we also are in that Mediterranean sweet spot where the diurnal temperatures are. We're in the another important detail is we're in the valley, whereas the Appalachian actually goes quite a ways out of the valley, but we're in the bottom of the valley, so we get really wonderful diurnal temperature variations. It's not unusual to wake up at 50 degrees and go to bed at, or not go to bed, but have dinner when it's 85 or 90 degrees. And as things have gotten warmer, quite a bit warmer than that even. So
Yeah.
we have the Sonoma Mountain to our west and the Mayakama Mountain Range to our east, and the distance between the two is probably less than a mile. So,
Mm.
and that's really where we are. We're a little postage stamp, and it is. I like to think probably the vineyard itself was established pre 1900 in the late 1800s, and the founder, who's the vineyard name is Old Hill Ranch, and the founder's name was William Hill, William McPherson Hill, and he was really the first farmer, I should say, pioneer, maybe white person, to settle in the valley and start farming.
Mhm.
He actually bought his land from General Vallejo, who was the Mexican governor, around 1850, 1852.
Yeah.
And so I like to think that um, he had the choice to put the vineyard wherever he wanted, and he chose the best spot in the valley. That's how I like to frame it. Who knows
That's
exactly
good.
how it all went down, but we really do have a pretty special climate here as it relates to farming grapes. And
Well, yeah, good. I mean, because we're going to get into this, to what extent, what I always imagine is planting in the 1800s. Um, you didn't have a Home Depot or a vineyard supply store where you could run down and buy, trellis posts and wire, and like 1,000 yards of drip line and drip emitters and stuff like that. So you were thinking in very different ways about where you planted vineyards. I imagine. Do you get a sense that like the ecology of that spot what was informed those decisions in the sense of just the water table, the annual rainfall, and those kind of situations, as well as just the kind of soil type and everything else?
100%. Um, this little postage stamp has a perspective that we get this afternoon breeze. It's almost in the summertime, it's almost constant, and it starts usually 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And it's very subtle, unless there's a fire and it's damaging. But generally speaking, it's subtle, and it really is a low. It creates a dry environment, and it means that we have low mildew pressure. Given that we have cold mornings and then hot afternoons, uh,
Mm,
and mildew, while we have lots of tools to combat it now, was much harder to combat um, in those days. So I think that was probably what farmers were thinking about more than anything. And this is all
right,
conjecture because who knows? They didn't make a lot of notes about what they were doing.
right.
And then, of course, the fact that it's dry farmed is a function of the soil type. So they had to find, and there are Sonoma Valley is geologically very complex, and there's lots of different soil types in and out, and a lot of volcanic activity recently, warm springs, um, and so to find that spot where the soils are deep and alluvial, which is what this is, at least where the old vines are. And so those are really important details if you're, setting out to plant a vineyard.
Right.
Unfortunately, the folks that planted the vineyard didn't, write down what they were doing and why they did it. We'll get into when we
Right.
start talking about field blends. Um,
Right.
so we really just kind of make it up. While we tend to lionize the pioneers that came here early, the indigenous peoples that were here, um, they didn't lie about. Well, who knows what was going on, but it wasn't a bad place to be. There
Yeah.
were lots of Sonoma Valley itself was a wetland. It's no longer, but it was. There were considerable um, wetlands up near Kenwood, and creeks ran. And this is a segue into dry farming. Creeks ran through our vineyard
Mm,
really up until the 1950s, which were
wow.
stocked with fish, not stocked, but had fish in them. And the wildlife, as you can imagine, was abundant. Um,
Wow.
so, but no, it's not. Farming as a lifestyle change does not favor the the lazy. I don't think.
um, having is the that is a good segue, and I think historically, I mean, from your even before you, there was a philosophy of let's not get on the treadmill of chemistry and the this that kind of stuff that happens. I think even there were some Davis consultants who came out and said you should just rip it all out because they were looking at it with this modern eye toward productivity and mechanization. I mean, in the light of all that, do you, having seen how these cycles and trends in farming have come and gone, like what's your attitude? Like, how do you how do you relate to these things as they come up, and how does that inform where you are generally now? And then we'll dig into the specifics.
Um, you're referring to some of the history of the vineyard, the more recent history. When my stepfather purchased the vineyard back in 1980, he had some Davis consultants come out and look at it, and he loved to say with disdain how they recommended that they rip out the vineyard. The vineyard itself at the time was approaching 75 to 80 years old,
Mm,
and my stepfather, was an enophile, and he really, I mean, he never considered that as an option.
yeah.
He loved the way the vineyard was, and he loved the fact that it was dry farmed. He was a Otto. His name was a farmer himself. We have a family, still do, a truck farm, if you will, that my niece manages across the highway from the vineyard here. We grow, I don't know, 70 different SKUs of different things, and I use the word we, but it's not me. Um, but my point being is that Otto had a pretty good handle on what farming was. And he was very, very progressive. He thought that chemical agriculture was basically farmers being dupes to the chemical lobby by buying all these chemicals, and then you have to buy more chemicals to deal with the problems that the chemicals create. That was sort of
Right.
his feeling about it. So he was never gonna do take the vineyard out, but it did require a lot of work. It was in pretty bad shape,
Yeah.
and when I came on board in 2000, it still was in pretty bad shape. And as you and I discussed a while ago, I came out of Pinot Noir, if you will, from Oregon. That's where I'd cut my teeth and had been making wine. So I ended up on Old Hill Ranch, which is this 12-acre vineyard that is dry farmed. And I knew one thing is that I would have to dry farm it because although my stepfather had passed away, that was pretty much his dying words was dry farm that son of a bitch. And so I started thinking about my brand, and we have a brand called Bucklin, and I started making wine off of these old vines. And some context: the vineyard is, as I mentioned, 12 acres, and it's comprised of over 30 different grape varieties.
Yeah.
Zinfandel, of course, being the predominant variety, but all those grapes are co-harvested and co-fermented, and I think previous generations thought of it as Zinfandel, and one of our first jobs was to really help people understand that it's much more than just Zinfandel. There's so many different elements to this vineyard. So to your question, um, I think about it in the context, or not in the context, but in the world of wine. There are just so many of the same things. It's so rote to make Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Cabernet. And granted, the joke I tell myself is that those Davis consultants might have been right if we'd planted Cabernet. Um, Cabernet has a lot more, how do you say, cachet than Zinfandel does, and that means it tends to fetch a little bit more on the market. So, even though our vineyard has a pedigree, it's still a struggle in terms of the financial returns. So, having said all that, I just figured, we're doing this wonderful field blend, so let's just focus on that peripheral area of the business, which is, things that are um, not Chardonnay, if you will. And so we've planted a few field blends here and there, in addition to the old vines, and really focus on this idea of co-fermentation and what that means, and in terms of wine, and I am a believer, lock, stock, and barrel believer in the idea of co-fermenting and how that influences the final wine product. So it's a very difficult conversation because it's not scientifically, well, there is some science to it, but it's not
Yeah.
easily to dissect it. Anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Well, it's a good start. It brings up lots more questions. But yeah, let's just jump right into the dry farming, because I think that's so important to where you are. And I mean, I had a conversation. I don't know if you know Kelly Mulville. I worked Piscinus Ranch. Actually, I've made wine here in Los Angeles from an old vineyard that's dry farmed in the Cucamonga Valley. It's like 19 teens is when it was planted. Mostly Zinfandel, little head trained, sort of scrub. I mean, basically, you look at, if you're driving by on the freeway, it looks sort of like an abandoned lot, like a 300-acre abandoned lot. It's not until you get down close that you're like, oh, they're vines and spaced out, and they each of the, sort of the cordons or whatever the arms of these things are really just. I mean, what I realize is they're just really long spurs. Like they're all,
You're right.
like
That
that just
is
from pruning for decades. They've just been really long spurs. That's what is
correct.
that what yours is like that too? I haven't seen yours, so I'm curious
Well,
if it
some of the
is.
vines certainly are. I mean, we are constantly forming and changing the vineyard in the
Yeah,
the positions. Um, Talking about dry farming, however, so there's two different things I think about. One is water and how important that is to our survival
yeah,
and the use of it. And the other is grape and wine quality.
mm,
Those two really different things. And I'm a believer that water is a very sacred and important um, element of Sonoma Valley, and it has been abused and used, and to the point where um, if you think about how farmers farm in general, they don't like water on the land. And really, the main principle of dry farming is to slow water down, which means leaving water on the land, and that means a lot less tractor driving. And if you do drive tractor, you really could damage the soil.
right,
So slowing water down is a big deal, and that allows the water, of course, to penetrate into the soil. And if it soaks up the water, that's your bank for the season. So that's a kind of a small or an important element to dry
yeah.
farming.
I hadn't
Now,
thought about that.
farmers in general, when they want water to run off the vineyard, they put in drain tile, they put in um, slopes, and they make water move quickly. And what happens is all that water gets into the creeks very quickly when it rains. So the
Right.
creeks run faster. That channelizes the creeks. So it's a feedback loop,
Yeah.
similar to what's happening with the climate. So you get deeper channelized creeks, which drain water quickly and more quickly, and so on and so forth. Um, if you talk about wine quality, then you're saying things like, well, these vines, and people have seen vine roots as deep as 40 feet, and they've seen them in when they've dug these wine caves, and they looked up and they said, what are those funny things hanging down? They shouldn't be there, and they're roots. So we don't know how deep our roots go here, but we know they're deep and they're diffuse, and
Hmm.
so they're connected. They're connected to the soil.
Yeah.
And if you go underneath an irrigated vine, those root masses are going to be smaller and less diffuse. And if you're French, you would say, because really most of Europe is dry farmed, you would say,
Right.
if you want to talk about terroir, if you want to talk about the character of the place, you need to be connected to the place.
Yeah.
And that is why I believe that dry farming is more interesting It's not always qualitative. It doesn't necessarily make better wine, but it makes more interesting wine, in my opinion. And it also makes for a common thread from vintage to vintage, which is what people come back to us for, is because there is a certain character which I could put words to it, but it doesn't really make sense until you taste the wine, what that means. So, yeah, those are two disparate reasons to dry farm, and you can't dry farm everywhere, and you can't dry farm any vineyard, and you have to really establish it from the beginning. Um, it's not easy to convert backwards, but if
Right.
you're in the right place, and much of Sonoma is the right place, and most of the vineyards that I know that are from this generation have succumbed to irrigation, and
Mm.
um, there's a good reason for it, and that is that irrigated vineyards produce more fruit, and
Right.
so which is compelling, I got to say.
As a farmer, I bet. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
we've had some pretty serious droughts in the last couple
y-
decades.
yeah, I mean,
Um,
what did you do before 2023, that 10-year stretch from, 2013, 20, yeah, 13 essentially to 2020?
2014 was pretty dire. I always remember. So if you looked at our vineyard now, it's robust. It's verdant. There's cover crops coming up, 12 inches to 18 inches. It's wet. Um, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
2014, if I was out there today, it was just still brown. We had not had any rain.
Mm.
Um, and the cover crop, germinated finally because we did get some spring rains. Um, and it was challenging. I was doing some trials with doing no-till, and one of the, if we want to talk about dry farming, there's a lot of old school techniques, and a lot of us trying new school techniques, and trying to tillage. I think is one of the main old school tools that was used. And if you remember, I think it's Aesop's fables, the story of the father who told his sons that he'd buried gold in the vineyard, and so they went and dug and dug and dug, and it turns out that he was just getting them to till. So they would, and the gold was in the harvest. Um,
Right.
anyway, that is sort of the paradigm that we're facing, and um, so we're trying other things. So anyway, the drought. Um, the drought, we lost a lot of vines through attrition. That's what happens, and a lot of the vines, when they get old, they are more vulnerable to lots of different things. So
Sure.
so that requires a lot of work to replace them, um, and and the vines stressed. And then in 2020, we had this really dramatic season of smoke. Um, and so we lost a lot of solar gain. And the vines in 2021, with the drought, with the fact that it didn't have a lot of solar gain the year before during the growing season, we had a very difficult year in both just yield, but also the fact that we had to take a lot of the yield that we had off the vines because because they just couldn't support that. And now, after 4 or 5 years of pretty good rainfall, maybe it's 3 or 4 years, really
Yeah.
2017, right? So it's even longer.
Yeah, I
It's
think
been
2023 was our first good year, and it's
well,
continued to be.
2017 was ridiculous. We had 55 inches of rain. Uh,
Oh, okay.
but the drought continued. That did not bust the drought, as they say,
Right. Right.
but it was a really uh, it helped us. And but yes, this was 2021, and so that was a particularly difficult year. And one of the things that I grapple with personally and think about a lot is um, how I. This is a hard thing to articulate, but my I grew up around vegetable farming, and I became involved in the wine industry, and I worked in Oregon for 10 years, which is almost universally dry farmed, at least it was then.
Mm.
And I came here, and I just, you look at the climate, it's dry in the summer, it's hot, and you just go, how do these vines survive?
Mm.
So the hard part really is just accepting that they do survive. They can take it. They're
Right.
amazing. And that's really the challenge for me was like, I keep like talking to people. When should I put in the irrigation? Do I need to put in the? It's just, but they just keep on going, and and I still grapple with that. That's not a done deal. I still wonder about climate change and how we're going to be able to continue doing this forever. But right now, it's looking pretty good, and this last season was pretty healthy, and we've had some pretty significant heat spells as well as drought that one might have wanted to irrigate had they had the option.
Right. Yeah. So I have several questions. So I would love you to talk about the tillage that you do. Do you? I think last time I heard you were probably going for like that idea of like a dust mulch kind of tillage where
No,
you
that's
no.
there is a this is scientific. It's a pretty effective way to dry farm, and it's if you go back just a generation, you would find a lot of farmers employing this in Napa, which is basically just you pulverize the soil by tillage, and by doing it, and it requires many passes. It's really once every people would say once a week to once every 10 days. They're in the vineyard running a disc or a harrow through it, and you create this. If you walk in it in your boots, you'd sink in it. You'd sink down 2 inches into this mulch of dust, and basically it's a mulch. It just prevents evapotranspiration. It's effective.
Hmm.
So that was what I was. I wouldn't say I inherited that because we never really had enough equipment when we started anyway to achieve anything like that. But um,
Okay.
I have I've done trials with no-till. I'm interested in no-till. In fact, I have uh, other blocks that are have irrigation where we have employed no-till, and we have a new equipment. It's considerably retooling to try a different technique is not inexpensive. So we've taken it very seriously. But in the old block, which is still dry farmed, we do one pass. Well, first off, we mow,
Hmm.
and we actually I go back up even before that. So in the fall, we plant a cover crop, and our cover crops are robust. And I often think of myself as a cover crop farmer more than a
Great.
grape farmer. Getting a good cover crop stand. When we mow it in the spring, usually in February, March, hopefully March, just depends on the season. We will mow it and pulverize it, and then we incorporate it into the soil, and that's what we call our green manure. It is a lot of legumes, so there's nitrogen fixing, but really the most important thing is carbon, getting
Right.
carbon in the soil, back into the soil. And we use a spader, which is it's a think of it as a shovel turning the soil over, and we really only do one pass a year. That's and it does a very good job. It's very slow. It's very methodical. And then that our vines are spaced 10 feet apart. So that's a 5 foot section. And then the other 5 feet, which is underneath the vines, we don't till, and that is a recent evolution where we don't
Okay.
go underneath the vines with anything but a weed eater. So that part of the soil is undisturbed. And I have done some trials with no-till in the old block, and the attrition is unacceptable. So it just is not effective. And this is another interesting philosophical question that I grapple with. Is so while I understand that it's all very vogue right now to be into no-till, where is the benefit of no-till outweigh the benefit of not irrigating? And
Mm.
I don't
Yeah.
have an answer to that, but I'm always trying to push the envelope and figure out how we can accomplish both. I mean, the reason that you might say that no-till is important from an environmental perspective is because you might be um, sequestering carbon more effectively than you would be with the tillage, and tillage itself actually burns carbon. So maybe that could be argued as a more important detail in terms of how farms impact the environment, and we're not going to get very far without water. So and Sonoma
Right.
Valley is under duress with regards to water in terms of the availability for farms right now, and especially during drought. But aquifers have been and are being depleted, and so we're fortunate. We actually have great water source here. It is beautiful, crystal clear water. The guys call it Los Flores. They love it. They come here to fill their water jugs before they go out and work in other vineyards. So it's precious. And
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
that's my short tutorial on dry farming. It is.
Yeah. Let me go ahead. Finish your thought.
Well, one other thing I really want to emphasize is not doing something is really awesome when it comes to farming.
Yeah.
Just
No doubt.
going and turning on a water is not easy, and you got to turn it off, and you got to manage it, and you got to look and make sure nothing's leaking. It's a lot of work to irrigate. So not irrigating is quite liberating.
This is gonna come back when we talk about hybrids, but I have some questions. So is the attrition rate, when you say attrition, like you lose vines when you're not tilling, or your productivity decreases, or what is when you said attrition rate, what were you referring to?
Well, so the vineyard so these vines of the 12-acre old block were planted in the 1880s.
Yeah.
And they were all planted on St. George rootstock, which is why they're able to be dry farmed.
Got it. Yeah.
And they die. So,
right. Okay.
they don't, vines die for a lot of reasons, and age, old vines are more vulnerable. So if the vineyard is 100 and almost 50 years old, 140 years old, I casually say that it's an average age of 80 years. When I inherited the vineyard, my stepfather, in his wisdom, had replanted a fair portion of it without any rootstock. And so those vines had succumbed to phylloxera. And so there was quite a large amount of vines that needed to be replaced.
Well, that's it for now. If you are not a paid subscriber, if you'd like to become a paid subscriber to get full access to this and all the content at Beyond Organic Wine, you can easily do that at beyondorganicwine.substack.com. Thank you so much. And here's a little music from Colden Pro. A big thanks to him for this.